My dad abandoned me for my cousin's success, but karma struck back as I reclaimed my life and left him in regret. Growing up, I always had a deep admiration for my dad. He was my hero in so many ways, the kind of father who seemed to have all the answers and provided for the family without hesitation. But as I grew older, I began to notice that his attention wasn't equally distributed among everyone. My cousin, Derek, always seemed to have a special place in his heart. At first, I didn't mind. After all, Derek's parents had passed away when he was young, and my dad took him under his wing. It seemed noble at the time, and I even felt proud of my father for stepping in when Derek needed it most. But over the years, that pride began to shift into confusion and eventually into resentment. The shift wasn't sudden, but more of a gradual drift. My cousin, who had moved in with us after his parents' death, started receiving all the support, both emotionally and financially, that I assumed would be equally shared between us. What was once a father-son bond became a distant and strained relationship. Derek was the golden child in my dad's eyes. Every achievement of his was celebrated, and every failure was met with endless support and encouragement. Meanwhile, my efforts, whether in school or extracurricular activities, seemed invisible. No matter what I did, my father's eyes were fixed on Derek. It was almost like I was an afterthought, a background character in my own family. I remember one summer when I was 14. I had worked tirelessly on a science fair project, hoping it would impress my dad. It was a complex study on renewable energy sources, something that took hours of research, planning, and execution. When the day of the competition came, I won first place. I couldn't wait to get home and share the news with my dad, hoping that maybe this would be the thing that made him look at me with pride. But when I got home, there was no celebration. Instead, my dad was busy preparing a small party for Derek, who had just made the local soccer team. I stood there, holding my award, trying to mask my disappointment as my father praised Derek in front of the whole family. No one even noticed my trophy. It was the first time I realized I might never truly have my father's attention. As the years went by, the distance between my father and me grew. Every milestone in Derek's life was treated like a grand achievement, while mine were brushed off as inconsequential. High school was where the differences in treatment became the most apparent. Derek was the athletic type, charming, popular, and good at sports. He excelled on the soccer field, and my dad couldn't have been prouder. Derek's games became family events, with my dad cheering from the sidelines, beaming with pride every time Derek scored a goal. My father spent countless hours with Derek, coaching him, attending practices, and making sure he had the best gear. I, on the other hand, was more academically inclined. I loved studying and excelled in my classes. I dreamed of going to college, becoming an engineer, and making a life for myself. But my successes seemed to pale in comparison to Derek's athletic achievements. My father never attended my school events, and any time I tried to share my academic accomplishments, he would quickly change the subject back to Derek's soccer career. Things came to a head when it came time to start thinking about college. I had worked hard, earned good grades, and even received a partial scholarship to a prestigious university. I was excited. This was my chance to finally step out of the shadows and build a future for myself. But when I approached my dad about helping me with the remaining college expenses, his response was cold and dismissive. "I don't have the money for that," he said flatly. "You'll have to figure it out on your own." I was crushed. All my life, I had assumed that my dad would help me with college, just as he had helped Derek with everything else. But that wasn't the case. While my father had poured thousands of dollars into Derek's soccer career, buying him the best equipment, paying for elite training programs, and even covering his travel expenses for tournaments, he had nothing left for me. I couldn't believe it. I had worked so hard, done everything right, and still, it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, Derek was being groomed for success, with my dad funding every step of the way. It was like I didn't exist in his eyes, like my future didn't matter. Derek's soccer career continued to flourish, and my father's obsession with him only grew stronger. By the time Derek graduated from high school, he had received several offers from colleges eager to have him on their soccer teams. My dad was over the moon. He practically lived through Derek's achievements, pouring more and more money into supporting Derek's ambitions. Meanwhile, I was struggling to figure out how I was going to afford college. My partial scholarship wasn't enough to cover all the costs, and without my father's support, I was left to fend for myself. I took on multiple part-time jobs, working late nights and weekends just to save enough money to attend school. While my friends were enjoying their senior year, I was constantly stressed, trying to balance school, work, and planning for my future without any financial help from my family. The final straw came one evening during dinner. My father announced that he had decided to fully fund Derek's college education, covering not just his tuition but also his room and board, books, and other expenses. My heart sank. I sat there in silence, trying to process the fact that my father had chosen to support Derek's future over mine. "What about me?" I asked quietly, barely able to keep the hurt out of my voice. My father looked at me, almost surprised that I had spoken up. "I already told you," he said dismissively. "I don't have the money for both of you. You're smart, you'll figure it out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad had essentially written me off, deciding that Derek's success was more important than mine. It was at that moment that I realized I was on my own. Determined not to let my father's abandonment define me, I threw myself into my work. I applied for every grant, scholarship, and financial aid opportunity one could find. I worked long hours at a local diner, saving every penny I could. There were nights when I barely got any sleep, balancing schoolwork with my part-time job, but I was determined to make it work. When the time came, I managed to scrape together enough money to attend a local state university. It wasn't my dream school, but it was a start. While Derek was off at a prestigious private college, fully funded by my dad, I was living in a cramped apartment with 3 roommates, working nights and weekends to pay for tuition and rent. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to succeed. During those years, I rarely spoke to my father. We drifted further and further apart, and it became clear that his focus was entirely on Derek. The few times we did talk, it was always about Derek's soccer career and how proud my dad was of him. It was as if my life didn't even matter to him. But I didn't let that stop me. I worked hard, pushing myself through school and eventually earning my degree in engineering. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt like giving up, but I refused to let my father's neglect hold me back. I built my life from the ground up, without any help from him. As I began to establish my career, Derek's life took a different turn. Despite my father's relentless support and financial investment in Derek's soccer career, things didn't go as planned. After a few years of playing college soccer, Derek suffered a serious injury that ended his chances of going pro. It was devastating for him and for my father, who had built his entire life around Derek's success. Suddenly, all the money, time, and energy my dad had invested in Derek seemed to vanish into thin air. Derek had to drop out of college, unable to continue without the athletic scholarship that had been tied to his soccer career. My father, who had spent years supporting Derek's dreams, was left with nothing to show for it. As for Derek, he struggled to find his footing. Without a degree or a clear career path, he drifted from job to job, unable to replicate the success my father had envisioned for him. The pressure my dad had placed on him to succeed had taken its toll, and Derek was left feeling lost and directionless. My father, who had once been so proud of Derek, began to express disappointment, and their relationship, once so strong, began to deteriorate. Meanwhile, I had slowly but surely built my life. I had a stable job in engineering, a modest apartment, and a sense of pride in what I had accomplished. While my father had been so focused on Derek's success, I had quietly gone about creating a future for myself, one that didn't rely on anyone else's approval or support. It wasn't long before my father's regret began to surface. He reached out to me one day, asking if we could talk. I was hesitant at first. After years of neglect, I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear what he had to say. But part of me wanted closure, so I agreed. We met at a coffee shop, and as soon as I saw him, I could tell that something had changed. My father looked older, more worn down than I had ever seen him. There was no trace of the proud, confident man who had once put all his hopes into Derek's future. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "About everything. About you." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I made a lot of mistakes," he admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing by supporting Derek, but I didn't realize how much I was hurting you in the process." I looked at him, my emotions conflicted. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let go of the years of pain and disappointment. But another part of me couldn't forget the way he had abandoned me, choosing Derek's success over my own future. "I can't change the past," my father continued, "but I want to make things right. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even if I wasn't there to support you." His words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had craved his approval, and now that it was finally being offered, I didn't know how to feel. Could I forgive him? Could I move past the years of neglect and hurt? In the end, I realized that I didn't need my father's approval anymore. I had built my life without him, and I was proud of what I had achieved. My father's regret was his own burden to carry, and while I appreciated his apology, I knew that it wouldn't erase the past. We talked for a while longer, and while we didn't magically repair our relationship, I left the conversation feeling lighter. I had spent so many years trying to prove myself to him, but now I realized that I didn't need to. My success, my happiness, they were mine, and I didn't need his validation to feel whole. As for my father, he continues to struggle with the consequences of his choices. His relationship with Derek remains strained, and the regret of neglecting me weighs heavily on him. Karma had come full circle, and while I had built my own life, my father was left drowning in the regret of his past decisions. But for me, that chapter of my life was over. I had reclaimed my future, built a career, and found my own sense of self-worth. My father's choices may have shaped my past, but they didn't define my future. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. The years of neglect had hurt deeply, but they had also shaped me in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. I had learned how to stand on my own, how to solve problems without relying on others, and how to value the things I worked for. My father's disregard had, in a strange way, forced me to grow into a stronger, more independent person. While I was reflecting on these things, I realized that my life had taken a path that I could be proud of, one that was built entirely by my own hands. No one had handed me success. I had earned every piece of it. And as painful as my relationship with my father had been, I had grown to accept that some people will never give you the validation you crave. It's something you have to give yourself. As I found peace in my accomplishments, Derek, on the other hand, was facing his own battle. Without soccer, he was lost. He had spent his entire life chasing the dream of becoming a professional athlete, but when that dream was cut short, he didn't have a backup plan. My father's relentless focus on Derek's soccer career had left him unprepared for the realities of life outside the sport. Derek bounced from job to job, struggling to find purpose. His once close bond with my father began to fracture under the weight of unmet expectations. My father had placed all his hopes on Derek, and when those hopes fell apart, the tension between them grew. The more Derek tried to live up to the image my father had created for him, the more he struggled, and the more distant they became. My father, who had spent years idolizing Derek's potential, was now faced with the consequences of placing all his energy into one person. It became clear that he was disappointed, not just in Derek, but in himself. His grand plans for Derek's future had crumbled, and with that came a realization of the damage he had done to both of us. I couldn't help but notice the irony in how everything had turned out. My father, who had chosen to invest in Derek's future while neglecting mine, was now faced with the failure of that decision. Derek's life, which had seemed so promising, had derailed, while I, the overlooked child, had quietly built a stable and successful career. It wasn't that I took pleasure in my father's regret or Derek's struggles. In fact, I wished Derek well. We had grown apart over the years, but I never held him responsible for the way my father treated me. He was just as much a victim of my father's favoritism as I was. But there was no denying the poetic justice in the situation. My father had placed all his bets on Derek, believing that his success was guaranteed. Meanwhile, I had worked in the background, unnoticed but determined. Now, with the tables turned, it was my father who found himself filled with regret. The life he had hoped to create for Derek never materialized, while I had forged my own path without him. After college, I had thrown myself into my work. I had started at an engineering firm, where my skills and work ethic quickly earned me respect and promotions. Over time, I built a successful career, eventually moving into a management position. I was financially stable, living in a nice apartment, and enjoying the sense of fulfillment that came with knowing I had achieved all of this on my own. For years, I didn't speak to my father or Derek. There was no animosity on my part, but I had come to terms with the fact that they were no longer part of my life. I didn't need my father's approval or Derek's friendship to feel whole. My life was full of purpose, growth, and the knowledge that I had taken control of my own destiny. Occasionally, I would hear updates about my father and Derek through family members. My father's health had started to decline, and Derek was still struggling to find his way. I felt compassion for both of them, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to re-enter their lives. One evening, as I was unwinding after a long day at work, my phone rang. It was my father. I hadn't heard his voice in years, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I should answer. But curiosity, and perhaps a lingering sense of obligation, won out. "Hey," I said hesitantly. There was a pause on the other end before my father spoke. His voice was frail, a far cry from the strong, confident man I had known growing up. "Can we talk?" he asked, sounding vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard before. I hesitated, but then nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Sure." We talked for a while, and for the first time, my father was honest about his regrets. He acknowledged the pain he had caused me and admitted that his obsession with Derek's success had blinded him to the importance of supporting both of his children. He apologized sincerely and told me that he was proud of what I had accomplished, even if he hadn't been there to witness it. It wasn't the dramatic moment of redemption that I had once dreamed of, but it was something. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need a grand apology to move forward. My father's acknowledgement of his mistakes was enough. I had already found peace on my own, and his regret, while bittersweet, didn't define my happiness. After that conversation, I decided to keep in touch with my father, but from a distance. I wasn't interested in rebuilding the relationship to what it had been before, because I knew it never truly existed in the way I had once hoped. But I wasn't angry anymore, and I didn't want to carry that burden of resentment with me. We spoke occasionally, and though our relationship was far from perfect, it was enough for me. As for Derek, he reached out to me too. He apologized for the way things had played out, admitting that he had always felt the pressure to live up to my father's expectations. He told me that he admired what I had accomplished and hoped we could reconnect as cousins without the baggage of our past hanging over us. I appreciated his words, but like with my father, I decided to keep things at a distance. Derek and I had grown into very different people, and while I wished him well, I wasn't sure if we could truly be close again. I had built a life that was fulfilling on its own, and I didn't feel the need to go back and fix things that were broken beyond repair. Looking back, I realized that karma had played out in its own way. My father had made choices that favored one child over the other, and in the end, those choices led to his own downfall. While Derek struggled under the weight of my father's expectations, I had thrived in the freedom of being overlooked. But the most important lesson I learned was that karma wasn't about revenge or seeing others suffer. It was about growth, resilience, and the realization that you don't need validation from those who don't see your worth. Life had given me challenges, and I had risen to meet them, not for anyone else's approval, but for my own. In the end, I built the life I always dreamed of, not the life my father had envisioned for Derek, but the life I had envisioned for myself. And that, to me, was the greatest success of all.